Rain pressed softly against the black umbrellas, turning the cemetery into a blur of dark fabric and lowered heads. The sky hung low, heavy with a grief that felt almost rehearsed. Rows of polished shoes sank slightly into the wet earth. Expensive coats brushed against one another as mourners shifted, whispering condolences that sounded more like business negotiations than sorrow. At the center of it all stood Adrian Vale, billionaire investor, philanthropist, and widower for exactly 3 days. The casket before him gleamed beneath the gray light, white roses draped across its surface, their petals trembling each time a gust of wind cut through the hill. Inside lay his wife Isabella Vale, 32 years old. Radiant even in death, they had said, peaceful. Adrian stared at the wood as though it might answer him. The priest's voice rose gently, reciting verses about dust and return, about peace and eternity. Adrian heard none of it. He kept seeing her that morning at breakfast 2 days ago. The way she'd laughed at something small, a smear of jam on his tie. The way she had reached across the table to wipe it away herself, as if she still believed in gestures instead of staff. She had collapsed an hour later. A sudden cardiac arrest, the doctors said. It happens. Even to the young. Even to the beautiful. Adrian had signed papers. Dozens of them. He had nodded at professionals who spoke in quiet, efficient tones. He had allowed strangers to close the lid on the only person who had ever looked at him without calculating his worth. Earth to earth, the priest said softly. A shovel scraped against soil, and then a voice tore through the hush like a blade. She's not dead. Every head turned. At the edge of the gathering, near the service path where trucks sometimes passed, stood a man in a neon orange sanitation jacket, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. His boots were caked in mud. One hand gripped the fence. The other trembled in the air as though pointing at something only he could see. Security moved immediately, stepping toward him with tight expressions. Adrian felt irritation flare first, then disbelief, then something colder. Hope was too dangerous a word, so he refused to think it. "Remove him," one of the board members muttered under his breath. But the man pushed forward, desperation in his voice. "You can't bury her. She's alive." The cemetery fell into stunned silence. Adrian stepped away from the casket. "What did you say?" The garbage collector swallowed hard, rain streaking down his face. Up close, his features were sharper, younger than Adrian expected. Late 20s, maybe. His eyes burned with something fierce and unpolished. "I said she's alive," he repeated. "I saw her." A ripple of disbelief swept through the crowd. "You saw her where?" Adrian asked, his voice steady but hollow. "In the ambulance," the man said. 2 nights ago. I was on my route near Park Avenue. The ambulance was stopped. The back doors were open. They thought no one was watching. Adrian felt his pulse hammer in his ears. "Go on." "They brought her out," he continued, pointing shakily at the casket. "She was on a stretcher. They said she didn't make it. But I was close. Too close. I heard her." "Heard what?" Adrian whispered. She gasped. The word hung in the air. The priest shifted uncomfortably. "Sir Griefkin." "I know what I heard," the man snapped, surprising everyone with the strength in his voice. "I've worked nights for 5 years. I know the difference between a body and a living person," she gasped. And one of the paramedics said, "It's just residual." But then he leaned close and said something else. Adrian stepped forward. "What did he say?" The man hesitated, glancing at the cluster of wealthy faces glaring at him. "He said, we can't let this complicate things." The world tilted. Adrian's breath shortened. "Complicate what?" "I don't know," the man admitted. But they shut the doors fast after that, and the ambulance didn't go to the hospital. It turned toward the private clinic on Belmont. A murmur spread like fire. Adrian's mind raced. The clinic on Belmont was owned by one of his silent partners. A discreet facility, exclusive, quiet. He turned to his chief of staff, who looked suddenly pale. "Did the ambulance go to Belmont?" "It was handled," the man replied carefully. The doctors confirmed. "Did it go to Belmont?" Adrian's voice cracked through the air. "Yes," he whispered. Adrian felt the ground shift beneath him. He looked back at the garbage collector. "What's your name?" "Matteo." "Why didn't you come sooner?" Matteo's jaw tightened. "I tried. I went to the police. They laughed. I called the clinic." They hung up. I don't have access. He gestured vaguely at the funeral, the suits, the wealth. But when I saw the obituary this morning, I knew this was my last chance. Rain dripped from Adrian's lashes. He stared at the casket, at the white roses, at the finality waiting beneath polished wood. Open it, he said. Gasps erupted. Sir, that's highly irregular, the priest protested. Open it, Adrian repeated louder. Security hesitated, then looked to him. He nodded once. The workers approached slowly, their hands trembling as they unscrewed the lid. The sound of metal turning against metal echoed unnaturally loud. When the lid lifted, Isabella lay as they had prepared her. Skin pale, lips tinted faintly pink, too pink. Adrian's heart pounded so violently he thought he might collapse beside her. Isabella, he whispered, reaching down. Her skin was cool but not cold. Call an ambulance, he barked. She's been pronounced, someone argued weakly. Call one anyway. Mateo stepped closer, eyes fixed on her face. Wait. He leaned in, holding his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, so faint it might have been imagination, Isabella's chest fluttered. Adrian froze. It happened again. A shallow, fragile inhale. Chaos exploded around them. Someone screamed. Phones appeared. The priest stumbled back, crossing himself. Adrian dropped to his knees, gripping Isabella's hand. Stay with me, he begged. Stay. Her eyelids twitched. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance, growing louder. Adrian looked up at Mateo, who stood rooted to the spot. Rain streaming down his face like tears. Their eyes met. In that moment, wealth dissolved. Status vanished. There were only 2 men and a woman suspended between worlds. At the hospital, hours stretched into eternity. Doctors rushed in and out of the room. Machines beeped. Papers were signed again, but this time with urgency instead of resignation. A rare neurological condition, they explained. A form of catalepsy so profound it mimicked death. Her heartbeat had slowed to nearly undetectable levels. Combined with a sedative administered during transport, it had created the illusion of finality. She was alive the entire time, the neurologist said quietly. Adrian felt rage surge through him like fire. Then why was she declared dead? The doctor hesitated. That is under investigation. By nightfall, the truth began to unravel. The partner who owned the Belmont Clinic had recently taken out an enormous insurance policy on Isabella's life, using a clause buried within shared investment agreements, a clause Adrian had signed without scrutiny years ago. The clinic had financial troubles, massive ones. Declaring Isabella dead had been the simplest solution. Adrian sat beside her hospital bed long after the room emptied. Machines breathed softly. Her fingers twitched in his grasp. When her eyes finally opened, they were unfocused at first. Then they found him. Adrian? She whispered. He broke. All the composure, all the polished control, shattered into tears he hadn't allowed himself in decades. He pressed his forehead to her hand. I thought I lost you, he choked. She blinked slowly. I heard voices. I couldn't move. His stomach twisted. You're safe now, he said. Days later, when the scandal erupted across headlines, Adrian stood before cameras not as a titan of industry but as a shaken husband. Beside him stood Mateo, awkward in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit. Reporters shouted questions. Flashbulbs flared. Adrian raised a hand for silence. This man, he said, placing a steady hand on Mateo's shoulder, saved my wife's life. Mateo shook his head. I just said what I saw. Adrian looked at him with something deeper than gratitude. Most people see and stay silent. He turned back to the cameras. For years I believed power protected me. That wealth ensured safety, but it nearly cost me everything. The person who saved my wife was not a board member, not a partner, not someone with influence. It was a man the world barely notices. He paused, emotion tightening his throat. We measure people by the wrong things. In the weeks that followed, arrests were made. Lawsuits filed. The Belmont Clinic shut down. But something else shifted too. Adrian sold his stake in multiple ventures. He funded reforms in medical oversight. He created a foundation in Mateo's name dedicated to protecting the vulnerable from institutional corruption. Mateo returned to work after refusing every luxury Adrian offered. I don't need your money, he said gently. I just needed you to listen. One evening, months later, Adrian and Isabella walked slowly through a park. Her arm looped through his. The air smelled of autumn leaves and second chances. "Do you remember anything?" he asked softly. She nodded. "I remember feeling alone, like I was shouting underwater." He tightened his grip on her hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" "For believing the world worked the way it was supposed to." She smiled faintly. "Now you know better." As they passed a sanitation truck parked by the curb, Matteo hopped down from the back waving. Isabella squeezed Adrian's hand. "There's our hero." Matteo laughed when he reached them. "You look alive," he teased. "I am," she replied warmly. They stood there for a moment, 3 lives intertwined by fate and courage. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting everything in gold, Adrian felt something unfamiliar but grounding settle in his chest. Gratitude, not for wealth, not for influence, but for the voice that refused to stay silent in the rain. Because sometimes salvation does not arrive dressed in power. Sometimes it comes in muddy boots, shouting the truth when no one else will. And sometimes, the person the world overlooks is the only reason you get to hold the one you love again.